has been much criticism on the Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan and the failed SAA-Takatso Consortium purchase deal. The relationship between Gordhan and the chair of Parliament's Public Enterprise Committee, Khaya Magaxa, has also soured. This comes after the committee requested that the SIU probe the cancelled Takatso Consortium's purchase of a 51% stake in South African Airways. Well, as we kick off the week, let's bring in Dr. Guy Leitch, who's an aviation analyst. He's also editor and publisher of SA Flyer magazine, to help us understand if the SAA deal really stood any chance. Guy, good morning to you, and thank you so much for giving us your time. This has been a really interesting one to watch, right? I don't think we expected that the blowout, certainly out of the announcement that the deal had collapsed, would be as big as it, seeing that exchange of words between Khaya Magaxa and the Public Enterprises Minister, and certainly the suggestion then that the matter be looked at by the SIU. But I'm interested in hearing from you what you think this says to the global aviation community around SAA as a representative of South Africa's aviation public sector.
Yeah, hi, Naledi, and nice to be with you and your viewers. Well, it says a lot about the whole approach of the South African government to privatization and to the airline. And in retrospect, of course, it became clear that the deal was never actually going to work, and it was only working because Pravin Gordhan insisted it was. So, in fact, in my opinion, the wheels fell off pretty quickly off when it became apparent that the state was trying to sell off an asset worth probably at that stage at least 3 billion rand for a notional 51 rand plus some cash injection that would come from somewhere, possibly banks. That was what first raised the red flags. Then the Competition Commission kicked out a key component of the deal, which was the aviation skills and facilities from global airlines. So the deal should have died then, and the extraordinary thing was that it didn't. Pravin Gordhan kept kicking the can down the line. He went as far as to say he would repeal the entire Act of Parliament that creates SAA. They were getting the licenses, and so it went on. And it really became apparent to me that this was just nothing much more than a gigantic confidence trick being played on the South African taxpayer, the public, by the government for the sake of giving the airline 2 or 3 years to get back on its feet. And then they were simply going to turn around, as they've done, and said, okay, well, we don't need the private sector anyway. We're going to continue to own it outright. And that's why it is such an important development for the world's perception of our government, and in particular its promises to privatize the airline.
I mean, then of course there's the Public Enterprises Minister saying, well, SAA can sustain itself for 18 months. And in that portfolio committee of public enterprises, a real issue of contention there about how exactly that can happen. What do you make of that? 18 months SAA to self-sustain. And if you believe that that's even possible, what then after the 18 months?
Well, the 18 months is very questionable. There are 2 sets of numbers out in public right now. The numbers that were provided to the Parliament's Committee on Appropriations, which suggested that the airline was going to make R1 billion loss this 23-24 year. And then we have Professor Lamola and others saying, oh, no, don't worry, it'll actually make a profit. I'm inclined to believe that it'll make a loss because it may just be operating profitably, just in terms of covering its direct costs, but I'm prepared to bet it's not making proper provision for end-of-lease costs to return aircraft, for depreciation, for long-term maintenance, and any other number of items that would turn a possibly operating profit into a huge loss. So yes, Pravin Gordhan may be correct when he say it can operate for another 18 months, but then what? Then it's really not going to have enough money to be able to sustain itself. So quite frankly, the airline will need a bailout, whether it needs a bailout by selling a majority shareholding or even being sold outright to a private sector operator, or whether the government betrays its promises and bails it out. We don't know at this stage. But the airline, by its own admission, is short on capital, and short on skills, and that's what it needs the private sector for.
That's a lot to be short on. Capital and skills is a lot to catch up with. I've seen a few articles this morning of a few analysts and pundits essentially saying perhaps what we need to be doing is have a conversation where SAA has a conversation once again with Ethiopian Airlines, saying, well, even before 1994, this was an option, that Ethiopian Airlines and SAA could partner, and that's possibly a way for us to save SAA from liquidation. What do you make of that?
Yeah, it's not a bad suggestion. In fact, the better suggestion was developed by Nico Bezuidenhout, who was twice acting CEO of SAA, when he proposed a tie-in, a JV with Emirates, which would have been a better partner than Ethiopian. I think that the government has a problem with Ethiopian because it's another African airline, and there's a matter of pride here. There's a matter of the flag notion of having a flag carrier and the pride of not surrendering your airline to another airline. None of those are good enough arguments. Quite frankly, the whole argument these days that our government should be running an airline is completely fallacious. Yes, there are one or two examples of successful state-owned airlines out there, but SAA will never be one of them as long as we've got a government that interferes with its state-owned enterprises, that imposes its own political agenda and a development burden on these airlines. We've got no hope of SAA ever succeeding. And certainly, SAA is never going to be the airline it was before, because in the interim, under business rescue and under COVID, it really has had its lunch eaten on all the key routes, that it's never going to be able to compete successfully back into Europe or to the USA. So it's going to end up being nothing much more than a regional carrier, if it has a right to exist at all. And honestly, the more time passes, the more that right needs to be questioned.
But this is after SAA has launched routes into Brazil, for instance. So are you saying those aren't sustainable?
I don't know. Last week, the airline announced that it has leased two Airbus A330-200s. Those would probably be okay for the Brazil route and now the Perth route. So finally, it's beginning to get a long-haul fleet. But, it doesn't have the benefit of state guarantees. So that means it's trying to finance aircraft on its own really appallingly weak balance sheet. And that means it's probably paying way over the odds. And these are older aircraft, older generation aircraft. They're not going to be able to compete against Airbus A350s or even Airbus A330neos. So SAA will be paying a very high interest rate for obsolete aircraft already. How does it compete against that? But it does at least know which routes to operate.
Yeah.
The best routes that it can do are these east-west routes. In other words, linking South Africa to South America through Sao Paulo and east to Perth. Those are the routes that it can operate with reasonable lack of competition. It's the north-south routes that it's really going to struggle on.
Okay, can we talk pricing a little bit? Because obviously we can talk about the sustainability of SAA, but even if it continues to run, it does need to compete with other airlines from a pricing point of view, something that is considered a little bit difficult. And then there's the calls, of course, for the SIU to get involved, so there's accountability and transparency. But it seems like that's going to be a big issue for SAA. News 24 over the weekend reporting that SAA is battling with a former employee who refuses to return classified data on pricing, right? So classified information, and I'm reading from the piece now about its pricing and fare construction data that was allegedly stolen by a former employee, Tanusha Chiba. This is really concerning.
Well, yes and no. I'm not sure that the two issues tie together at this stage. I don't know that the theft of the so-called classified data has any direct impact on the SIU or a potential SIU investigation. That's just normal competitive information. And the key thing here is that we must understand that airlines now use what we call the dynamic pricing model to sell seats, and what the variations on that are. In other words, a lot of airlines won't allow a seat to be sold for more than 3 times the cheapest seat, even if it's the last seat to be sold on the aircraft. But SAA may have different constraints on that, and if that information gets out to the competitors, well, then it is very useful competitive information there. It needs to be pointed out, though, that I'm worried about SAA's pricing right now. There was a quick informal survey done on the social media about what the prices of seats were to Durban, and SAF Air is currently about nearly 2 or 3 times as expensive as SAA. Now, that's really bad news simply because there's such massive demand over periods like the Easter weekend that SAA should be taking full opportunity of the ability to charge higher airfares, and yet it doesn't seem to be doing so, which means that it's not succeeding in selling all its seats, that it's not succeeding in actually meeting market demand out there. So, again, it shows that it's not actually competing as well as it should be able to.
Yeah, I think just one final question, and this is really just a broader one, I suppose, if you'll let me, Guy, and that is, just watching this, do you think that after an investigation by the SIU we'll get those answers and accountability of what really happened with the deal, if you're optimistic about that, and what do you think this does to the legacy of an outgoing now Public Enterprises Minister, Pravin Gordhan?
SAA and Mango have absolutely demolished Pravin Gordhan's remaining goodwill in terms of his image. He did such good work with SARS and so on, but his tenure as the head of the public enterprises has been an unmitigated disaster, with so many of them absolutely failing abysmally. So no, I mean, and his absolute stubbornness in terms of refusing to sell Mango, and his stubbornness in terms of perpetuating the myth that was the Takatso deal, have absolutely ruined his reputation. And of course, I think that the SIU investigation must go ahead, because it's quite possible that there are worms in the mix, that, for instance, he'd made completely unreasonable guarantees or warranties or promises about profitability, for instance, to the Takatso Consortium on SAA or on further funding. And if those come out, and they would need to come out, or at least the whole deal would need to be cleared of those allegations, then we definitely do need this SAU investigation. Yeah.
Well, let's leave it there. Always a pleasure speaking to you. Guy Leitch, the aviation analyst. He's an editor and publisher as well of SA Flyer magazine.